Welcome everybody to our first video interview with a linguistics student, Kiara Braum, who actually this isn't the first time that Kiara and I have spoken before. We were uh, students together in an Italian course at Wits, right?
Yep, we've met many times.
Exactly. Many times in the classroom, and this is probably the first time we're actually meeting each other directly online.
Yeah,
So, for the benefit of our audience, Kiara, would you like to introduce yourself? Because they don't know you as well as I do.
sure. I'm Kiara Braum. Um, and I've just finished my honors in linguistics, and I'll be telling you more about it later. I'm really very passionate about language, about people, about women and their roles in all of these things. Yeah, I think language is something that's applicable to everyone, and I've kind of always been obsessed with the written word and the spoken word and what those do for us and how we can use them. Yeah.
Fantastic. And your honors is in linguistics. You also majored in linguistics at university. Would you care to
Yeah.
describe what linguistics is to our audience?
So yeah. So linguistics, usually when people ask, because they do ask every single time when I tell them what I'm studying, they're like, what is that? No one ever knows what it is. Which is fine to explain. But yeah, it's basically the scientific study of language. So what that really means is that language is, as I said, kind of a natural occurring phenomenon, and it exists everywhere in the world with people, anywhere that you look. Wherever people are, language happens. And so linguistics is concerned with studying and observing and I guess classifying that natural phenomenon in greater detail so that we can figure out, yeah, how it works, more about it. And it's split into, it's mainly about, I guess you could say, the sound of language, the structure of language, and then the meanings of language. So those are the, I would say, like the three schools or the three broad focuses of linguistics. Yeah, and I think, yeah, it's basically just figuring out language in greater detail. Yeah.
Precisely. Well, that means that given that that's a common, a universal human occurrence, linguists have quite a broad mandate. And what we
Mm.
want to discuss here today is not only linguistics in general, but your study within linguistics on silence, which I thought was an extremely interesting topic, and also your reflections as a linguist on the process of language learning and how perhaps your studies on silence in language apply to learning a language. So why don't we go ahead there and jump straight into your thesis on silence in language, which I thought was really interesting. When we think of language, we think of the sounds, we think of the words. We don't think
Mm-hmm.
about the fact that the space, even in a textbook, even in written language, the space between the words is perhaps as important as the words themselves in constructing meaning. And your thesis examined this phenomenon. So why don't you give us a brief overview of what you studied?
Sure. So my thesis was titled "Confronting the Silence: A Linguistic Study of Silence in the Lives of Young South Africans," and it became something different to what I initially wanted it to be. But I've always been kind of, I always noticed the silence in interactions. So whenever I'd be having conversations or even observing other people's conversations, whenever there would be a silence, it would kind of, stick very strongly. And it always made me feel very kind of anxious and like, oh no, something in this conversation is going wrong, something's not functioning properly. And how can I fix this? How can I amend this? And I basically wanted to see why that was. Why did I have that reaction to this phenomenon, and what was going on with that? And so my curiosity was whether other people felt similarly, pretty much, so that I could use studying others to explain myself, which I think is what a lot of academics are doing, actually. But yeah, I think that's what the main point was. It was initially going to be something more gendered because I thought that men use silence differently to women. But I kind of discovered through, even though this was a small study, I discovered that it's quite universal. Like the way that people react to silence is both the men and the women in my study had similar reactions similar to mine as well, which were anxiety and confusion. So yeah, I think that was the main idea behind it. I interviewed 8 people. I don't know if how much detail you want me to go into, but I was also interested in the context of our specific context, like how South Africans and people who are our age view silence. Like maybe our cultural context changes the way that we think of silence. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, perhaps could
Yeah.
you provide us with a definition? How did you go about defining silence, defining the void? Seems like probably the first major challenge that study had to confront.
Yeah, definitely. So that was one of my questions in the interviews that I had with people, was that, well, how do you define silence? And most of the responses, which is how I'm going to define it now, was like a lack of
Hmm.
language. So,
Interesting.
and a lack, specifically, what's important is that it's a lack of communication. So it's not just that I'm not speaking, but I'm winking at you, or I'm like giving you finger guns. It's that nothing is happening. So there's no reference. I can't figure out anything by looking at you because there's a complete lack of communication, I should say. So that was interesting that people thought that, and that's also intuitively how I would say it. What I discovered was that definition of silence has kind of silenced silence in the world of linguistics, because people often said, as you said before, like, oh, I never thought silence could be something that is relevant to linguistics, or something that there's something to study.
Yeah.
But actually, there's a lot to study in it, and it's because language can't exist without the lack of language. So the two define each other. Silence can only exist because language exists sometimes, and language can only exist because there's a space between all of our words and between what there is and what there isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. I think that's very interesting if we look particularly at the history. So I finished an excellent book which I recommend to every listener here by Walter Ong, who was a Jesuit researcher
Okay.
at I think he was at Harvard University for some time, and he wrote a brilliant book called Orality and Literacy, and he traces the development of societies as they begin to move from being primarily oral cultures like the culture of Homer, for example, and even to a vestigial
Mm-hmm.
extent the culture of Dante, and then
Mm.
when as those societies become print cultures, they start to conceive of language and meaning in slightly different ways. But what's interesting is that the common thread throughout that is the importance of the supposed gaps in communication, the supposed gaps in information. When
Yeah.
spaces were introduced in the Middle Ages into Roman script, that made a huge difference in communication and in meaning. Before writing was all in one line. There weren't spaces between words, and
Yeah.
the
That's so
introduction in
interesting.
text, which is something I'm more familiar with, has just as much meaning as the introduction in of silence in speech, right?
Mm.
And what then maybe one of that leads on to a question I've got, which is what did you find and what do you still find are the functions of silence in speech? Because you spoke about how it's a misconception, thinking that silence is nothing,
Mm.
whereas in reality it's at least as communicative as the words we're using.
Definitely. I think we can all think of experiences in our lives where silence has been present and we felt something. I mean, the classic example is the silent treatment. That's kind of weaponized silence to get something, to get some kind of response, or to communicate something very clearly without saying anything. And
Yeah.
that's an interesting thing, because silence can really demonstrate power in a situation. It can really show that something's going on here and I'm in charge. With the silent treatment, for example, it's like, take a couple. If the girlfriend is giving the boyfriend the silent treatment, what's happening is that she's saying, I'm not happy with this situation, but I'm not going to, I want to make you suffer a little bit, pretty much, which is power. So that's one of the things. And one of the researchers I included in my study, Sylvia Bonacci, she talks about how in a conversation, when silence suddenly occurs, it disrupts the equally distributed power dynamics. And so when you're expected to speak, and you stay silent, suddenly the other person is like, what's going on? Because now the power shifts, and then the other person starts to really question themselves in this, their own role in this conversation, because their role is just kind of automatically undermined a bit. So that's like a very interesting function of silence. It can also be very evil, like use this for good, not evil, please.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think to demonstrate power, and another thing which is linked is to show disapproval. A lot of people that I interviewed viewed silence as disapproval of something that they had just said. So if you think of, you're in a group of people, everyone's laughing, chatting, having a good time, you say something, silence, you'll immediately be like, oh my God, what did I say? Why did I say that? And that's because there's this assumption that silence equals disapproval, because we live in this society which is quite speech-based, actually. And to engage with the society, you need to speak. So when there's the lack of that, you become alienated. Even, you know, even if that's not really happening, that's how it feels. Yeah. Also, in some cultures, it's used to save face. So to not embarrass yourself, or
Yes.
if you're kind of unsure and you don't want to talk too much, you use silence, yeah, just to not embarrass yourself, or to avoid confrontation.
Yes. And I
Yeah,
think
and one of the main things, yeah.
no, apologies there for the interruption. So I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the sort of the cultural
Oh,
component,
sorry.
uh,
Okay.
that that languages are just as languages differ amongst cultures, the use of silence differs as well amongst cultures, and
Mm-hmm.
that's that process
Definitely.
of one becoming accustomed to the silence of another culture is as important as one becoming accustomed to the words of another culture. Maybe you could speak a little bit
Definitely.
about what you found, what your research found on this particular topic. And given that, for example, this community is a community of language learners who are keen to, I think our message to them would be that when you're learning a language, focus as much on the silences as the words itself. Maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think that's quite beautiful. I think that's a very interesting way to think about it, because I found quite a lot of differences culturally when I was researching this. For example, in Japan, um, kind of the common generalization is that Japanese people prefer silence over, like, let's say, idle chatter. So kind of small talk, kind of nonsense. What did you do on your weekend? Blah, blah, blah. And that's because silence is just seen as quite respectful and quite, yeah, polite, especially when someone else is talking. Silence is the go-to, because in Japanese culture, at least, it's showing that you know, you're giving them the time of day and you're focused.
Hmm.
Whereas, and that's also true, I found in Finnish culture, it's the same kind of thing, where it's like long silences will be given in conversations to show I'm really here. I've got my patience and my respect, and I'm here, I'm present. Whereas, like in American culture, and even I would argue in South African culture, based on what I found, silence in that kind of way, where it's in conversation between sentences, um, is seen as quite rude and quite distant. If I'm talking to you, I finish my sentence and you say nothing, I'll feel kind of strange. Like, are you listening? What's going on here? Are you focused somewhere else, or is your mind drifting? And that's very interesting. I mean, a lot of the examples that they gave were business related, and it was like, if you're a Japanese businessman and an American, and you are speaking to each other, but your silences don't, you know, they don't connect, you can walk away thinking, oh, that guy was such an asshole. You know, sorry for my language. But when it's not necessarily the case, it's just that your silences mean different things in your cultures. So as you say, learning the silence is very important, I think. Yeah, especially if you're coming into learning a language without really knowing anything. Maybe you're just passionate about it, you're not connected in a, you know, familial way or friend way or whatever. I think you should definitely keep the silences in mind, as something to become familiar with, for sure.
Interesting, very,
Yeah.
very interesting. And maybe now moving sort of from the realms of certainty to speculation. going a bit beyond your thesis, maybe we can talk about a few reflections you have, and maybe just sort of general ideas,
Mhm.
applications of your research to the process of language learning. So I'll start with one simple question. Sappiamo che hai studiato l'italiano. We know that you've studied Italian.
Sì,
I
sì.
was there when you were doing it. So my question is, in your own experience, what role has paying attention to silence played in learning Italian?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because to me at least, Italian is not a very silent culture or silent language. Like it's, you know,
No
you kind of
comment. No
know the
comment.
stereotype, which is true, and I can say it because I'm a little bit Italian. It's that, you're talking all the time, everyone's talking over each other, no one can get a word in. And I do think that's a bit true. So silence for my own language learning, I don't think um, it's played as big a role as if I was learning, for example, Japanese. But
Mhm.
it has been that um, it's influenced my interest in silence, definitely, because when you're always talking over each other, there's no room for there's no room for silence, there's no room for any of the positives that silence brings or the negative that silence brings. So I think um you become very eager and very quick to speak. So I think that can be a good thing, actually. I don't know if that's really applicable to me completely because I'm still quite shy to speak Italian, but yeah, I'm not sure how silence factors into Italian just because it's so loud.
Yes.
um,
Well, I think it's very
yeah,
interesting that
I'll be
that's
interested to know what you think about that, actually.
uh that's wow. I wasn't expecting to even talk about that. So I think my what I can say is, and this blends quite interestingly with a lot of the consensus in applied linguistics, which is that um, language learning is done predominantly through input. At least the very first phases are input. This is the famous sort of Stephen Krashen hypothesis from I think developed predominantly in the 70s and 80s, and so in many ways, and I think this sort of flies counter to a lot of what people initially feel intuitively, but in a lot of ways, silence
Mhm.
is the key skill to master when you're learning a language because so much of it is paying attention to what's coming in. Now, I think that's a general
That's true.
rule. With my case personally, I think that's it's particularly acute. I'd say that I don't feel comfortable in kind of outputting language, speaking or writing until I've absorbed a lot of content. That sort of thing would probably vary person to person. But as a general rule, as something that's sort of been, as far as we can, statistically been proven to be true of a large sample size, silence is an integral part in learning any language. Maintaining personal silence so that you can
Mm,
kind of absorb a lot of the language
very
incoming. I
true.
think that's an interesting link between your topic and this kind of vogue
Yeah.
term in language learning, and particularly
Yeah.
amongst language learning enthusiasts, the input hypothesis. Um,
Yeah.
maybe
And
yes.
just reminded, oh,
Now continue.
sorry, just one thing. You reminded me of something. When when especially in the beginning of when I was learning Italian, you as a shy language relates, science can really help you when you are in a conversation with someone who speaks the language. You figure out a lot based on, especially in a language like Italian, based on gestures, based on facial expressions, based on the responses. And I think, yeah, silence really gives you that space to focus on maybe the non-verbal communications, which really help you understand the verbal communications eventually.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's definitely a helpful aspect of it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's true. I think every language has got its, every culture has got its certain gestures, its certain ways of nonverbal
Yeah,
communication, and ultimately silence fits within that category of nonverbal communication. Um, and learning those cues are as important as learning the words. I think we under
mhm.
we underestimate how visual a people we are, or I say
Yeah,
people, visual a species we are, we might say. Um, and we're constantly in conversation, picking up these tiny cues in how other people,
exactly.
shift their bodies vis-a-vis others,
Mhm.
how they move their face, how they move their hands, how they gesture, etc. And so, yes, I think that's something you also pick up in the process of learning a language. It's not this purely the irony is that learning a language isn't purely learning the words, the vocabulary. It's not like purely
No.
propositional in that sense. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
and I mean, so
And I
then
think it's important to.
no, continue. I think there's a slight
Um,
gap, so please
I was just
continue.
gonna say. Oh, sorry. Okay. I was just gonna say it's. I think it's important to remember in regards to this that language isn't a theoretical thing. It's not something that's dead. It's not like a fixed object.
Yeah.
It's constantly, it's alive. So there's some kind of, yeah, you have to take into consideration that it's, you're not going to learn a language by reading a language or by, you know, studying every single part of the verb conjugations, whatever. You have to participate. And yeah, I think that's important,
Yeah.
that language is alive all the time.
And on that subject of participation, I've got another interesting question, which is, how do you think that by being aware of silence in conversations, we can actually improve how we engage in conversations, be it in our home language or in the language that we are studying?
I think really confronting the silence is about understanding that silence in conversation is never one thing. It doesn't ever indicate a specific something. And so understanding that means that you can kind of relax into the silence because you don't actually know what it means, which is a freeing thing. Because lots of these participants said, and I used to feel, every time silence happens, it means I'm doing something wrong, or it means that this person's angry with me, or they're upset, whatever. And deciding that is really neglecting the vast possibilities of what silence can be. So I think that is something that's really helped me since I finished this project, which is that, you know, I can sit in the silence now. I can understand that sometimes silence can be really helpful. Like it can help you collect your thoughts. It can help you become grounded and become aware of where you are in the world. And that can be very beneficial in communication. Also I'm thinking of conflicts, let's say. I think staying a bit silent before you express yourself can really stop those heated words of exchange where it's like you say something you don't mean. I think it can make us much more mindful people and much more intentional people, especially with our language, intentional speakers, which I think would be very, very beneficial for everyone involved.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes, I agree. And
yeah,
I think something that's particularly interesting is that everyone who's learning a new language is bound to go through periods of discomfort in communication. That's just normal. I think anyone out there who's feeling that they are the exception or that they lack confidence simply because they feel uncomfortable in communication, they should rid themselves of that misconception right now because that's part of learning a new language. And but understanding that silence is a
yes,
natural part of conversation, I think also lifts some of that natural pressure off of those who are seeking to engage a bit more, to participate more in the language they're learning. Uh, and and so I think that, I mean, there's an interesting point about, I mean, there's
definitely.
an interesting context that our discussion is taking place on. You and I are talking across a video conferencing platform, across considerable distance, and we're using modern forms of communication. Uh, I have an interesting question regarding the application of your studies of silence on modern communication media. How do you think silence really affects modern technologies? Have they changed the dynamics of silence? Is it now more complex? I can think, for example, of the phenomenon of being of in a sense the frustration of someone not responding to your message. Um, you know, on a
Yeah,
text message service, that's a form of silence, but it's often a form of silence that we fill
yeah,
psychologically with our own negative interpretations. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah. That's very interesting. I didn't even think about ghosting. You know, like that's actually a really interesting. That's complete digital silence. Like, and it makes people feel the same or even worse actually than what I found. Like when people feel anxious and weird, it's like to me, it seems like that ghosting really amplifies those feelings. And I think it's because it's disconnected. It's not happening in real time. So you can make up your feelings and you can make up that person and what they think of you even more because you literally have the time and you're not in front of a person who's watching you. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
But I think, yeah, I was thinking about something kind of totally different to the ghosting thing, which was that I think a lot of our discomfort with silence is, and I did write about this, but I think it has a lot to do with how stimulated we are by social media and by these apps that are designed to grab our attention and never let it go. And I mean, the reality is that we spend a lot of our time on these apps, and so overstimulation is just like our norm, pretty much. And I think a lot of our discomfort with silence in conversation has to do with the fact that we're always stimulated, and silence is kind of by definition this lack of stimulation. And yeah, I think in that way, social media has affected how silence affects us. But I think it can also, I also saw that, and I believe that we are really seeking silence in a lot of ways, because we know that we're overstimulated, because we know that there's some better way that we can live and some better way we can use our attention. I think there is a real desire for some kind of silence, and even if that's an abstract silence, some kind of peaceful nothingness. I do think we have this kind of draw towards that, and that's what meditation is, and that's what these things, that these mindful practices, intentional practices that people that are becoming more popular, I think, these days, maybe than they've been in a while. Yeah, I think it has to do with all of that, really. Yeah.
Yeah, entirely agree. I think that's a very, very good point. Um, I'll finish off this conversation by saying that we will, if you are willing to do so, we will link your thesis in the description of this video, so that who's
Yes, I
interested
would.
in. Perfect. Yeah. So anyone who's interested in taking this further can read up more on this. Uh, what I think is an extremely interesting topic, and really completely restructures the way we think about languages and language learning, um, and restructures our kind of hierarchy of priorities when it comes to
Yeah.
conversation. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Kiara. Thank you very much for agreeing to do
Thank you
this.
so much.
I really enjoyed reading your thesis, and I'm sure everyone else who gets an opportunity to will as well. And thank you for sharing your opinions and your insight and your experience with us.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to talk about this thing that I've spent a year doing. So whoever wants to read it, go ahead. Yeah, I really enjoyed this interview. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic then. Well then, to Kiara and to everyone watching this video, I wish you a very good day or evening, depending on when you're watching this. And we will see you in the next interview. Goodbye.